I'd like to send a message now to the adolescent males to unburden himself of this stigma that society's put on him, this virginity burden.
This is Scott Beierle. On paper, he was a teacher and former soldier, but in reality, he had the dating skills of an old sponge and the social grace of a parking ticket. But instead of reflecting on his shortcomings and improving himself, Scott chose the lonely path of bitterness, anger, and delusion, and along the way, produced some of the worst music that humanity has ever endured.
I like to walk around late hanging out. I like to serve endless sauerkraut.
As time marched on, his behavior only grew more outrageous. He was fired from job after job, banned from multiple campuses, and somehow managed to make a nuisance of himself in almost every corner of his life. And yet, despite leaving a trail of warning signs and basically having walking red flag practically stamped across his forehead, Scott somehow managed to slip through all of the cracks. In short, consequences always seemed to skirt around him. Meanwhile, his videos and music grew darker, more violent, and somehow even more unbearable. His obsession with resentment seemed to metastasize into something far uglier than just bad lyrics or tone-deaf guitar riffs. I mean, even the federal authorities were tipped off about him. But even still, his case was dismissed until, tragically, it was too late. As a result, multiple lives were lost at the hands of Scott Beierle, a man who is dangerous, delusional, and just as insufferable. And today, we're diving headfirst into his disturbing world. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and I'm here to share the world's darkest and wildest stories with you, and provide anything we can learn along the way. So, who was Scott Beierle? What did all of these red flags look like? And how did this story change from concern to outright tragedy? Well, one thing's for sure, this story will leave you outraged, especially when it comes to his music. And so on that note, please get comfortable, grab a coffee if you haven't yet, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Scott Beierle. November 2nd, 2018 began like any other day in Tallahassee, Florida. Now, Tallahassee is a curious place that is filled with quirks and courage. Not only is it the state's capital, but it's also a bustling college town and a cultural hotspot. Streets are lined with oak trees and heavy with Spanish moss, giving it this quiet yet beautiful southern charm. And when it gets dark, the nightlife and university culture keep it both alive and unpredictable. For most people, this Friday was nothing unusual. People were busy finishing their workdays, students met up with friends for drinks, and in a quiet shopping plaza just off of Thomasville Road, a handful of locals gathered at Hot Yoga Tallahassee. To those who entered, this studio was their sanctuary after a long week of work, a place to escape the noise outside and to stretch and breathe and finally find peace in the stillness of the evening. However, peace can be a very fragile thing, and that night, they unknowingly found the total opposite of what they were looking for. Because that was the night that an insufferable and dangerous man was ready to walk in. The man's name was Scott Beierle. Now, at first, he seemed to just blend into the crowd. Just a normal-looking guy with a yoga mat and a black backpack. But our story today isn't only about the horror that unfolded inside the yoga studio that night, but also about Scott Beierle himself, alongside his insufferable ego, and the long and bitter path that led him there. And so, on that note, let's talk about Scott and why you should strive to become the total opposite of him. Okay, so who exactly was Scott Beierle? Well, on the surface, he was actually quite unremarkable. He was middle-aged, well-educated, and had a resume that ticked all of the boxes for a rather respectful person. He was an army veteran, a former high school teacher, and even had 2 master's degrees. So, to the casual observer, he might have even passed as someone that you'd trust or even admire. But as is the case with many of these monsters, once you peel back that facade, things aren't quite as they seem. And in Scott's case, what you'll find is a lot less army veteran and much more cringe Reddit user. Now, I'm going to be blunt with you here, but Scott's going to get a lot of heat from me in this video, and I'm not going to feel bad about it either. Because he wasn't just opinionated, He was a misogynistic and violent bully. In fact, a lot of his videos, music, and openly public beliefs will quite literally blow you away. So, it turns out that Scott had a long documented history of hating women, and it's probably the thing that he is now most known for. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there, because he also spouted many extremist beliefs and behaved in many ways that ranged from inappropriate to outright criminal. And his prejudice did not stop there either, because he was also racist, anti-Semitic, and basically carried a grudge against anyone who didn't look, think, or breathe exactly like him. In fact, if you were to make a Venn diagram of groups that Scott Beierle didn't hate, the only thing in the middle would probably be Scott Beierle. And even then, I'm not entirely sure. You see, Scott's bitterness towards the world started young. In one of his many video rants, he recalled being an awkward 8th grader, and one that was convinced that girls in his class were always plotting to embarrass and humiliate him. He described those moments of being ignored at the tender age of 13 as if it somehow were some kind of supervillain transformation. In fact, he would even moan about what he called, quote, virginity burden, of course blaming all of the girls for not giving him the romance that he believed he apparently deserved. At the age of 15, Scott even admitted that he could no longer stomach listening to love songs because they apparently reminded him of the life that he wasn't living. In short, while most of us were worried about homework or prom dates, Scott was already perfecting the fine art of self-pity and hatred. Things did not seem to improve either. In high school, his behavior was so troubling that he was ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluations on multiple occasions. In a video, he said, "I have never gone to a psychiatrist on my own volition, nor would I ever. I have been ordered to visit one on 4 separate occasions though, dating back to high school, all having to do either with females or my mania." However, behind those mounting concerns, Scott was quite smart actually. After high school, he went on to earn a bachelor's degree, followed by not 1 but 2 master's degrees in public administration and urban planning. With all of this behind him, on paper it actually looked like he had quite a solid future. With credentials like that, it's quite clear he was pretty smart, and to be honest with you, all he really needed to do at this stage was maybe have a bit of self-reflection and touch up on his social skills. I think those 2 things alone would have provided a stable career and a happy home, which then could have led to a future wife. And of course, all he really needed to do was first of all respect himself, but then secondly, and maybe even most importantly, was respect others. But obviously that didn't happen, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you this story today. And as the years went by, he didn't grow kinder or wiser, he grew stranger, angrier, and far more insufferable. Over time, Scott became obsessive over violent fantasies and infamous killers. In fact, he would even write about doing this sort of pilgrimage to the many sites linked to the serial killer Ted Bundy. This even included the boarding house and the sorority house where Ted murdered 2 women in 1978, which, by the way, is the same year that Scott was born. All of this was very concerning, because, you know, what was quite clear to me throughout all of my research is that Scott saw Ted's path as some sort of holy journey, which is really messed up, right? His attitude towards women was outright vile. In his writings, he would routinely demonize women. In one excerpt, he said, "Just beneath a woman's blushing lashes and innocent smiles lies the most rancid and putrid, sickening essences." Real classy there, Scotty. It is clear to see that if there was one thing as strong as Scott's misogyny, it was probably his unlimited self-entitlement. He believed that the world owed him affection, sex, and admiration, and he was furious when reality did not deliver. Online, he gravitated towards the Incel community, which, as many of you will already know, is an echo chamber where men seem to cry to each other about their lack of finding a partner. But the thing is, Scott didn't just seem to sympathize with incels, but he outright saw himself as one too. In fact, in one of his YouTube videos, he even praised Elliot Rodger. If you don't know who that is yet, then just Google him and you'll see what I mean. To Scott, Elliot wasn't an insufferable toad, but an inspiration instead, which, to be honest, really tells you all you need to know about him.
I'd like to send a message now to the adolescent males, if there are any ultimately watching, that are in the position or the situation, the disposition of Elliot Rodger, of like not getting any. I mean, I don't think a female can ever understand the societal pressure that's put on an adolescent male to unburden himself of this stigma that society's put on him, this virginity burden.
Now, socially, Scott was no different offline. Those who crossed paths with him described him as awkward, angry, and openly bigoted. I mean, even acquaintances picked up on his toxicity. So, in other words, Scott was just as tolerable as petrol in your morning coffee. His life seemed to be one failure after another, and almost always because of his own behavior. We'll go into why precisely in just a minute, but the long story short here is that Scott simply could not exist in normal society without stirring up chaos. After graduating, he took up work as an English teacher at Meade High School, which can be found in Anne Arundel County in Maryland. However, it wouldn't take long for trouble to follow. It turns out that not even 1 year into his post, he was investigated by police over a complaint from one of his female students. She claimed that apparently he had touched her arm and even suggested that she wore more revealing low-cut tops. And believe it or not, but he also asked her if she could maybe pose for Playboy. Police investigated these claims, but ultimately the case was dropped when they couldn't prove it. As a result, no charges were pursued. However, that is not to say that nothing happened. Scott was lucky not to face any prosecution, but it seems that the damage was already done, because shortly after this, he was no longer employed at the school. Whether he was formally dismissed or allowed to resign quietly under his own terms still remains unclear. However, what is clear is the pattern that it foreshadowed, because moving forward, you will see how many times this adult, who is in a position of trust, seemed to cross the line with a young woman and then just simply walk away with little consequence. So, you might be thinking, well, maybe the military could straighten out someone like Scott. But unfortunately, think again. In the year 2008, Scott enlisted into the US Army and would even graduate at the Officer Candidate School with the rank of second lieutenant. On paper, this looked like a promising career, and let's face it, it would keep him away from young women too. However, in reality, it was just another environment where his true character bled through. Within 2 years of being here, he was under investigation for inappropriate sexual contact with female soldiers who were under his command. So basically, even in one of the most disciplined and structured institutions in the world, he still couldn't help himself from being creepy and crossing boundaries. By 2010, the army had had enough. Scott was dismissed under unacceptable conduct, and yet, somehow, he still managed to walk away with an honorable discharge. In other words, his record stayed clean. What should have been a red flag of the highest order was instead quietly swept under the rug, and just like that, he once again slipped through the system. After leaving the army, Scott then moved to Tallahassee, where he claimed he was there for graduate school at Florida State University. But true to form, he quickly left behind a trail of complaints. It was in December of 2012 that Scott walked up to a student and then grabbed her butt, and when she spun around, of course being absolutely shocked, he muttered that it apparently was an accident. However, only a few minutes later, she then saw him do it to 2 other women nearby, both of them wearing yoga pants by the way, which is important for later on in this video. It was clear though that this was not clumsiness, it was assault in broad daylight. Scott was arrested and then charged with battery, and the FSU were very quick to ban him from ever returning to that dining hall again. However, when it came to pressing charges, his victims once again dropped them. For Scott, this was nothing more than a close call, and also kind of a lesson to teach him that there were no consequences in his actions. In the months that followed, there were 2 additional reports of Scott apparently groping women. In fact, by 2014, that pattern had become so undeniable that the campus actually banned him altogether. Put bluntly, Scott was a shameful creep that really needed to be stopped, but instead of prison or any sort of real accountability, he always managed to slip away. So, despite multiple arrests, not even one of them had led to a conviction. In 2012, and after groping students in the FSU dining hall, he was charged with battery. And later, in the year 2016, he was charged again for another assault. And even then, he still did not accept boundaries, picking up another charge for trespassing when he violated the campus ban. By 2018, Scott had at least 3 arrests on record. However, when you looked at his official file, it was still actually spotless. In short, with Scott having a technically clean record, he could actually pass background checks with ease, with these background checks being the tool designed to keep predators like him out of classrooms and workplaces, which is just totally staggering. Scott was routinely recognized as a danger, and yet when it came to acting decisively, all of these institutions seemed to drop their case, quietly fire him, or provide bans only to one specific location. And what makes this even more concerning is that this was not simply a case of Scott just simply slipping through the cracks, but he was quite literally committing extremely concerning crimes on military and university property. And yet here they were, just letting him get away with it too. Of course, this meant that after being fired at Florida State, Scott simply found another job, still as a substitute teacher in the Leon County School District. Even from the very beginning, staff had their doubts. Apparently, during his interview, he was described as looking rude, frustrated, and angry and scary throughout. He even asked that his password would be Carnifex, the Latin word for executioner. The staff who noticed this were horrified and recommended that he was not hired. But whether through oversight or simple desperation, that was ignored, and instead he started work the following week. It was only a few months into this new job that Scott found himself in trouble once again. But this time, it was because he was caught watching porn while covering a class filled with high school students. It wasn't subtle either, because apparently all of the students saw this when he accidentally broadcasted it to the classroom projector. Of course, when staff confronted him about this, Scott tried to make up this excuse that apparently it was a virus. But when staff checked his internet history, well, that told a very different story. And so it's no surprise to learn that Scott was fired on the spot. However, thanks to his still ever-clean criminal record, Scott found another job at another school in Florida. You're probably sick of this by now, but once again, he was fired within 2 weeks of starting that job after a child's parents came forward to say that he had very unsettling behavior. By May of 2018, he was now working as a substitute teacher at Galaxy Middle School, where, again, he was caught with inappropriate behavior towards a female student. From what I was able to find out, Scott basically asked the student if she was ticklish, and before she could even react, he then proceeded to stroke her just below her bra line. School administrators pulled him from the classroom immediately, but instead of cooperating, Scott then tried to flee the campus altogether. In fact, a school officer would even have to chase him down from across the parking lot to prevent him from escaping. And thankfully, for the first time in recorded Scott history, the school actually responded competently. He formally received a termination letter, with Volusia County Schools banning him from working anywhere in the system again, thus theoretically marking an end to his teaching career. By mid-2018, Scott had now been expelled, fired, or banned from 5 major institutions, including no less than Maryland Schools, the US Army, Florida State University, Leon County Schools, and now Volusia County. In every scenario, his misconduct included harassment, assault, or threatening behavior, most often directed towards women. And the crazy thing is, up until now, and in every single case, he somehow managed to walk away scot-free. By the summer of 2018, his life was basically in ruins. At the age of nearly 40, he was unemployed, blacklisted from teaching, essentially living in near total isolation, and of course, still single. His bank account would often dip below zero, and he could barely look his neighbors in the eye, because basically nobody wanted him there. In one of his songs, which was named My Glamorous Life, he basically sneered at this bleak reality, mocking his own circumstances, as if sarcasm could make the misery go away. However, what most people might see as a wake-up call, he only saw this as confirmation of his delusions. And you know what? I'm just gonna roll his track here for you to listen for yourself.
Shooting rats in my backyard's my safari, my 70 gremlins, my Ferrari. You'll never see me on a ski vacation. On my days off I work at a gas station. I don't have time to play croquet. I rob the neighbor's Christmas display.
Instead of pausing to consider that, hey, maybe I'm the problem, Scott doubled down instead. In Scott's eyes, his misfortune wasn't a lesson. It was evidence that he was a victim to all women. Now, once again, I want to stress just how often Scott would actually expose himself as a real danger to women. And this wasn't hidden or cryptic, but in plain sight. And these weren't isolated incidents or minor slip-ups either. They were constant, blatant, and deeply concerning. And the crazy thing is that everything we've talked about so far has pretty much been in the real world only. But when you look at what he was saying online, that was even more troubling. Over time, Scott would become further detached from society, and in its path, he would also find his own online echo chamber, where, no surprise, he found Reddit and the Incel community. And let's just say, all that did was inflame the situation. Using the name Carnifex, just like his work laptop password, Scott then flooded the internet with his vile content. As you already know, this mainly consisted of YouTube video rants and his own music. They became the main stage for him to broadcast his feelings, which basically meant putting toxicity onto anyone unlucky enough to listen. Now that you know about his predatory nature, it is probably time that we talk more about his music. I mean, look, just putting it bluntly to you, this is easily some of the most indigestible slop that I've ever had the displeasure of finding. Some of his tracks' names include Nobody's Type, Ephemal, Handful of Bare Ass, I Don't F Fatties for Free, and Who Let the Fags Out.
To hell with the boss, I won't get off my back. To hell with the girl, I can't get in the sack. To hell with the good times, I can't get back. To hell with my life, I can't get on track.
To call these songs terrible would be far too kind. Scott's so-called music was the kind of drivel that would clear out a karaoke bar before the first verse was even over. The guy was quite clearly painfully off-key, awkward, and just totally unlistenable. However, the real sickness here wasn't in his lack of talent, but in the lyrics. In one of his songs named Locked in My Basement, he talks about drugging a woman out of lust, locking her in his basement, and then doing unspeakable things to her. And you know the drill by now. Here's 30 seconds of it, just enough to sour your mood and make you wish I hadn't pressed play.
Now you're locked in my basement, you'll never say a word. When you scream out in terror, you cannot be heard. Oh, one day I know that you will learn to love me, but even when you do, I cannot set you free.
And here's half a minute of another song just to balance the mood out a little bit. Half the lyrics are completely indecipherable. The other half are pretty funny though.
Flap it in the breeze, flap it all around. Flap against the leg, I like to hear the sound. Flap it in the air, flap it in the sky. Better look out, gonna flap it in your eye.
Throughout all of these songs, it was quite clear that one major theme dominated his content. Of course, that being misogynistic extremism. As you've seen through parts of this video already, in 2014, and while still living in Tallahassee, he recorded a bunch of deranged rants before then uploading them to YouTube. Some of these are still available to this day, but by far and wide, most of it has found itself to archives across the internet. In one video, which was titled Plight of the Adolescent Male, Beierle talks about how society supposedly forces some young men to endure a sexless existence, where he then directly compares himself to Elliot Rodger, of course that being the notorious king of the incels.
I'd like to send a message now to the adolescent males, if there are any ultimately watching, that are in the position of the situation, the disposition of Elliot Rodger, of like not getting any. I mean, I don't think a female can ever understand the societal pressure that's put on an adolescent male to unburden himself of this stigma that society's put on him, this virginity burden. I remember telling a girl that this, I'll call her Thunder Thighs. I'm not going to refer to her by name. And I meant it when I said it, when I told her sex is overrated. That's not why I'm with you. That's not my primary objective in being with you. The dodo head, I'll get to her in another time.
In another upload, unsubtly titled The Rebirth of My Misogynism, Scott recalls his earlier life experiences, blaming women for everything that ever went wrong for him. He also described about how he felt targeted by the so-called collective treachery of girls, and also portrays himself as some kind of persecuted sexless hero.
Two females that I was working with. This was, I guess, an intermediate rebirth, and I was interacting with both of them. I must have asked for the phone number of the one, and she gave it to me, and I tried to call her on several occasions. I couldn't get through. I didn't know whether but she told me where she worked, in Boys Club. I said, okay, I'll go say hi. I left a message. Can you tell so-and-so I stopped by? Next thing, I get a phone call from the police. Oh, what's going on with these girls? Like, why are you bothering me? Why is this a concern of yours? Again, this mentality, let's just run to the authorities when our feelings are hurt. I'd committed no wrong. I'm just trying to hook up with this girl. Well, they've decided not to press charge. They've decided, really, have they? Well, thank them. I didn't ask what charges they could have pressed. What, for me being aggressive? Can I press charges against them being evasive? Malevolence can idle, or it can manifest itself into something. I felt such I still feel malevolence towards them, but have I been able to subjugate it? At the very least, they deserve to be emphasized and highlighted for their treachery.
There's a bunch of other videos he posted too, which I'll continue to pepper in throughout this video, but for now, here's a few more.
I'd like to talk about mongrelization a little bit today. I see a lot of interracial couples, in particular in this town, for some reason, although I guess that shouldn't be too shocking considering the demographics. But when I see an interracial couple, I think one of two things, and I don't believe I can't imagine that I'm unique in this. I think one of two things: either the guy couldn't do any better, or the girl's a whore, or has some variety of mental illness or psychological issue.
If Scott imagined himself as some kind of dark bard of misogyny, the reality couldn't have been any more pathetic. Would you believe it, but over the years, he vomited out more than 100 songs, laced with violence, hatred, and outright perversion. He would even go as far to rent studios and hire professional musicians to help record dozens of these tracks for him. However, as one sound engineer would later admit, Scott possessed zero musical talent. And one more thing to add here is that Scott's music was not only hateful towards women, but also towards other cultures, immigrants, and gay communities. So, you might be wondering, with so much violence and hatred towards people, why didn't anyone call Scott and his music out? Or at least report it to the police? Well, it turns out that someone actually did, because in August of 2018, one of Scott's old friends and his wife found his music, and out of morbid curiosity, they took a listen. His friend's wife was absolutely horrified, and so she did what all of us would hope a responsible citizen would do. She reported him to an anonymous tip line, which eventually would actually make its way to the FBI. However, after reviewing his material, they found that his content fell under protected free speech, and therefore concluded that there was no actionable threat. Great job, guys. This warning was a huge chance to capture a killer in the making, but tragically, it was ignored and then left to die in an email instead. And although hindsight can be 20/20, it is haunting to look back at this situation and realize that they were so close. When you connected the dots in Scott's content, the picture itself was actually painfully clear. This was a man who was fantasizing about becoming a mass shooter. I mean, he quite literally sang about it in tracks like "My Bullets Will Touch You," and if that wasn't enough already, he would even write about it and even talk about it in his videos. For 4 long years, Scott documented his failures with women, relationships, and work, and eventually, he arrived at one false conclusion: that violence was his solution. The really frustrating thing here is that all of his songs, videos, and essays were not merely harmless venting, but quite literally propaganda for violence. And it's worth highlighting here that he wasn't trying to hide it either. He was quite literally shouting about it. He spent years writing essays, recording songs, posting video rants, and even grabbing women in public. And when he was banned, fired, and expelled over and over again about this behavior, still nothing happened. The legal system quite literally shrugged it off and called it free speech. And if you really look at the truth behind all of this, the lack of punishment probably normalized it for him too. By the middle of 2018, Scott had nothing left but hate. Without a job, any prospects or community, and just a head full of absolute baloney, his mental health tanked from insufferable to outright dangerous. It was during this summer that, through his fantasies, he began to methodically prepare for one. On July the 23rd, 2018, Scott walked into a pawn shop in Orange County and bought a Glock 17. And because his record contained no actual convictions, his background check revealed nothing. Moving forward, over the following weeks, he stockpiled on ammunition. And in one sick display of control, he also chose to target a yoga studio, which, as you can imagine, would be a room filled with mostly women. You know, I don't think Scott realized this, but instead of shooting up a yoga studio, he could have simply just joined one instead. I mean, it's a great place to relax and get to know people that you could even go on to date. In August and then September of 2018, he meticulously researched Hot Yoga Tallahassee online, calling the studio multiple times to predict their schedules and crowd patterns. Moving into October, he unfortunately finally circled a date, and that would be November the 2nd at 5:30 p.m. And then, probably in what he believed would be his own way of leaving something behind, just like Elliot Rodger did, he then uploaded a song named F 'em All to the internet. Curiously, his entire album was uploaded on the same day that he planned the attack. And I know that it says November the 3rd here, but I think that's because I'm technically a day ahead in Australia. If you listen closely to his song, it basically spells out his plan to find as many females as possible to die with, which in hindsight is absolutely horrific.
When all I hear all the time is no, when all I feel is my frustration grows. Fuck 'em all! Fuck 'em all!
On the afternoon of November the 2nd, 2018, Scott drove more than 250 miles north from Deltona to Tallahassee. Inside the car was his Glock, extra magazines, and a yoga mat with him, of course to blend in for as long as he needed. He would even bring his own earplugs with him, not to drown out his own music while driving in his car, but to muffle the sound of his own gunfire. Scott arrived shortly after 5:30 p.m. with a black bag slung across his chest. Once inside, he paid for a single session, unrolled his mat, and then smiled. And believe it or not, but he even sickeningly told staff that he'd hoped the class would be bigger. He then waited both patiently and deliberately until the class was underway. And unfortunately, you know what happened next. And as you can see from the videos and news reports of the aftermath, it wasn't good.
Tonight, the mass shooting inside a Tallahassee yoga studio making national headlines has left people around the country and police asking why. The gunman killed 2 people and hurt at least 4 others. Police have identified him as this guy, 40-year-old Scott Beierle of Deltona. Investigators were at the home where he lived in Volusia County earlier today, and so was News 6's Clay Lepard.
Throughout the day, detectives were inside this home on Azora Drive looking for clues to try to help them figure out why a man would open fire on a Tallahassee yoga studio. Tallahassee police say 40-year-old Scott Beierle pretended to be a customer before pulling out a handgun at Hot Yoga in Tallahassee Friday evening, killing 2 people and injuring 5 others before killing himself. Officers searched the hotel room where Beierle was staying nearby, but they hoped they could get more answers from what was inside this home where Beierle lived in Deltona, nearly 4 hours away from the shooting. Several neighbors tell News 6 that Beierle was renting a room out of this home, but not for very long.
Quiet. I hardly ever saw him. I think he was a loner. And I can see that he minded his own business.
Beierle had been arrested in the past for grabbing women, but those charges were eventually dropped. We've also learned Beierle worked at Volusia County Schools in 2017, but it's not clear in what capacity.
We really just got a very weird vibe from him. My daughter had an incident with him at her job, and with kind of like watching people and making them feel uncomfortable, and so we just all got weird vibes from him.
Police say they still haven't found a connection between Beierle and the yoga studio or the people that were inside. In Deltona, Clay Lepard, News 6.
Scott Beierle opened fire inside that yoga classroom, and as a result, 5 people were injured, with a further 2 murdered. These numbers are already tragic, but what is also horrifying to learn is that if nobody'd intervened to stop him, it would likely be far higher. In the hours after the shooting, people learned that a man had actually attacked Scott with a broom and a vacuum cleaner, giving people precious time to run away. And I think after realizing that he was easily going to be overpowered, Scott then stopped his attack early and ended his own life instead. The police arrived promptly, with innocent civilians and bystanders from nearby restaurants and bars offering to help in any way that they can. And while those injured would go on to make a full recovery, it sadly was all too late for 2 women. Maura Binkley was only 21 years old when she passed away. She is remembered as a bright and kind student, and was the glue of her friendship group. She had her whole life ahead of her, and a future that was full of promise was cut short before it could even begin. Dr. Nancy Van Bessem was 61 years old and was a respected physician and the chief medical director of a major health plan. She was also a faculty member at Florida State University's College of Medicine. She had spent her entire life caring for other people, and now, close to her retirement, she was gunned down. In the days that followed, Tallahassee grieved. Vigils caught hundreds of people, and the city tried to honor what had been lost. For all who knew them, Nancy Van Bessem and Maura Binkley are remembered by the way they lived, with compassion, kindness, and strength, and their absence has left a hole that can never be filled. In the months after the shooting, the US Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center conducted a deep review on Scott's case, where they sought to publish a report to extract lessons from the tragedy. And unfortunately, but also kind of expected, their findings were quite damaging towards public trust. To begin with, they noted that Scott had what they referred to as, quote, a lengthy and publicly open history of misogynistic extremism. They also noted that he had displayed nearly every behavioral red flag on record, which included violent fantasies, a history of bullying and being bullied, financial instability, untreated mental health struggles, chronic interpersonal aggression, and an anger that only grew sharper with time. That means, for the first time ever in his life, Scott could actually offer people the entire package. It's just a shame it was kind of in the most rotten and horrific way possible. Experts would also conclude that not only are these all common markers among perpetrators of misogynistic violence, but in Scott's case, every marker was either missed or ignored. Put quite simply, the report's conclusion was unambiguous. It determined that both communities and law enforcement did not do enough to stop Scott in his tracks, and that included the FBI. The report's conclusion was both comforting but also bitter, because although Scott's rampage was certainly entirely avoidable, it at least forced this conversation into the spotlight. Before stories like Scott Beierle or Elliot Rodger, incel violence was rarely acknowledged outside of the internet, but now agencies across the world recognize it. And on the note of recognition, I just want to highlight here that Scott never actually achieved the infamy that he so desperately wanted. Quite the opposite actually, because instead, he's basically remembered as this insufferable coward who made terrible music. Over time, Scott's name will slowly become a distant nightmare, and for now, we'll remember the two who really mattered. Of course, that being Dr. Nancy Van Bessem and Maura Binkley. Friends and families will remember them for everything good that they had created. Of course, that being something that Scott never achieved. So, to wrap this case up, what precisely can we learn from this story? Well, more than anything, it's a cautionary tale. Not only should we never ignore warning signs like these again, but when someone commits a serious crime, it should be dealt with seriously. I mean, that's kind of obvious when I say it out loud, right? But in this case, that opportunity was missed on multiple occasions. And that's the case of Scott Beierle, and I think what makes this story so infuriating is how predictable this was years prior. Scott wasn't this misunderstood genius or tortured soul, but just some angry man who refused to better himself. Again, what I find fascinating here, and in a way ironic, is that Scott could have quite literally attended that same class, got to know people, and then even meet the future love of his life. Because yoga is filled with women, so why not just talk to them? The man needed therapy, obviously. I mean, anybody who refers to women as demons quite clearly needs help. Oh, and there is one other lesson to learn from this story. If you ever come across music this terrible, make sure you contact the FBI. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the case of Scott Beierle. Of course, I'd love to know what you think about this one too, so please leave a comment down below. On that note folks, thank you so much for being here today, I really do appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do consider doing so. Oh, and have you checked out my podcast yet? If not, go to Coffeehouse Crime on Spotify. As always, I'm back again very soon for another one, but until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.